This video is about the advantages and disadvantages of public versus private ownership, and then regulation versus deregulation. So when ownership of businesses or entire industries is passed from private to public ownership, so they will be owned by the government, it's called nationalisation. And with nationalisation or public sector ownership, a big benefit is that in comparison to having lots of smaller private sector businesses, if the government controls the whole industry, the scale of production will be huge. And so they'll be able to benefit from economies of scale, which means that the costs per unit are likely to be lower. And so therefore customers might benefit from lower prices in that situation. We've also got the government more likely to consider externalities when they're making decisions, because we've seen that the private sector firms don't consider those external costs, which leads to a misallocation of resources. And governments can conduct cost-benefit analysis, and that makes it more likely they'll take these external costs, these externalities into account when they're making those production decisions. Weighed against this, where we've got the benefits of economies of scale, there's always going to be the possibility of diseconomies of scale as well. And that's really quite likely in huge government-run organisations that we might get these inefficiencies, communication problems, coordination problems, and the disadvantages, therefore, of diseconomies of scale. And then we've got all the benefits of competition that will be missing under public ownership. So you remove that profit incentive and it makes efficiency much less likely with public sector ownership. We might decide to go the other way and take industries that were previously owned and run by the public sector and put them into private ownership, and that would be called privatisation. And the costs and benefits of that are going to be very similar, but flipped around. So it's just the reverse of nationalisation, the reverse of taking those industries from private to public ownership. So a benefit is that you get the power of markets, which are more likely to produce efficient outcomes. You've got that price mechanism, which means that you've got the incentive, the rationalling and the signalling functions of prices, which work to allocate resources using supply and demand. And the idea would be that that does the resource allocation more efficiently than public sector would be able to. You've also got the competition, which we said would be removed in nationalisation. That will be introduced. You get that profit incentive, which encourages innovation, and it encourages more dynamic efficiency as well. The downside to that, like I said, is very much going to be a lot of the advantages of nationalisation, but flipped on their head. So you've got these externalities, which the public sector are more likely to take account of. The private sector firms will not be considering those externalities, and so that makes market failure much more likely. They're more likely to over or under produce because they don't take account of those external costs. And then we've got the private sector. If left unregulated, we could get the growth of these private sector monopolies. So while we might have problems with the size of public sector enterprises and those diseconomies of scale, actually there's nothing to say that private sector firms might not grow into monopolies as well, and particularly because they've got that profit motive, which makes it more likely they would exploit customers once they get to that scale of operations. And so another option is to allow private sector firms to compete to a degree, to manage resource allocation and to own businesses, but to impose government regulations to maintain a level of oversight over these industries. And the main reason for doing that would be to protect the interests of groups that might otherwise have been exploited by these private sector businesses. So in order to protect consumers, we've got consumer protection laws like the Consumer Rights Act, and then we've got employment laws for workers such as the minimum wage. And that's the real benefit of these regulations, is that it will protect the interests of those groups who might otherwise have been exploited. But then the downside to that is that any sort of regulations are going to increase costs for firms, and that will have a negative impact on their competitiveness. And that will particularly be the case if they're trying to compete in an international marketplace where firms abroad are subject to lower regulations. So if you've got domestic firms that are facing a high level of regulation and lots of legislations they have to follow, and then they're trying to then compete internationally with firms abroad who have fewer regulations they need to follow, they will then find it very difficult to compete. And finally, we've got this problem of regulatory capture, which is when agencies that are formed to regulate the private sector actually kind of get captured by the industry and start to operate in their interests. And this is actually relatively common because these regulatory bodies that are set up, generally by their nature, they start to work quite closely with the firms in the market they're responsible for regulating. And in doing so, they're likely to work alongside them, and then it's relatively common they might start to follow the interests of those firms rather than following the interests of the groups they're trying to protect. And deregulation is simply the process of removing these excessive regulations and allowing firms to compete freely within markets. And so again, the costs and benefits will just be turned around. So we've got reduced costs this time for firms who hate rules and regulations and red tape, and removing this will help them to reduce their costs and become more competitive. It will also allow free markets to thrive with more competition and therefore improved efficiency. But weighed against this, you've got the potential for those groups that we're trying to protect to start being exploited, so those consumers and workers who don't have the laws to protect them anymore. And you've also got the possibility of unfair competition, which is where firms might gain an advantage using dishonest or even fraudulent activities when they aren't being monitored by these regulations.